Okay, well, everyone. Hi, I'm Glenda Bullock. I am the program chair for the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, and welcome to the first meeting of our 2021-22 season. And we are really delighted with our guest this month because we are celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month, which began, as you all probably know, a couple of days ago on September 15th, which was Mexican Independence Day, and continues through October 15th. So we have, I think, a very relevant speaker for us today. Just a couple of housekeeping details. If you are a member of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, you probably got a notice from Bill Walker recently that it is time to renew your membership. If you are not a member and you'd like to join, we would love to have you. The dues are very reasonable, $25 a year. That's for an individual or two people. And it includes not only advance notifications of our meetings, but also a subscription to Repast, which is a quarterly magazine on culinary history, which is lovingly edited by Randy Schwartz. And we also have a couple of theme meals every year, and we're very hopeful that we're going to be able to do our first one in a couple of years this December. So if you want more information about our organization, you can go to our website, which is culinaryhistoriansannarbor.org. We've got a couple of good programs coming up later this year. I still have my October program to be determined. So if you're watching and you have an idea of someone whom you'd like to hear from, I am always open to suggestions, and you can drop us an email at a2culinaryhistorians@gmail.com. So I think that kind of takes care of our business portion of the program. And now it is my delight to introduce our speaker. It is Maite Gómez-Rejón. She is the founder of ArtBites, and she has dedicated her career to exploring the nexus of art and culinary history through lectures, cooking classes, and tastings in museums and universities across the country. She has videos on her YouTube channel, ArtBites, cooking art history. She has a BFA from the University of Texas at Austin. She has an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She has a Grande Diplome from the French Culinary Institute in New York City. She's been a guest on the Today Show. She's been featured in Food and Wine magazine. She's been interviewed for the Splendid Table and the BBC's The Food Program. And she has contributed to Life and Time, Eaton Magazine, Gastro, Obscura, and other publications. And her essay, Mexico's Early Cookbooks, appears in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Latin American History. Again, we are so excited to have her here with us today. So without further ado, Maite, the show is all yours.
Thank you, Glenda. Thank you so much to the Culinary Historians for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to present on this subject, which is so close to my heart. Well, just food in general is, but Mexico's early cookbooks. So I will talk for about an hour and then happy to answer any questions, which is always the most fun part of this. So please put them in the chat or just don't forget to ask them in a bit. But Mexican food is amazing. And, Glenda and I were talking beforehand, and it's just, starting to get this excitement, I think, in the US. Lots of really interesting restaurants are opening up across the countries, mostly in big cities. And I think the perception of Mexican food has been changing through, over the past few years, which is wonderful. But Mexican food, Mexico in general has such a long history. And it's so interesting that the printing press was developed in the 1450s, in Germany, and it had made its way to Mexico post-conquest. But they weren't printing any cookbooks. They weren't printing anything as superfluous as food or recipes or anything like that. The printing press was exclusively for ecclesiastical documents or legal documents, and that's it. So we actually don't see the very first printed cookbook in Mexico until 1831, so 10 years after the independence of Mexico. So it's quite interesting. Spaniards, the conquest happened 1519 to 1521. We don't see a published, printed Mexican cookbook until, for another 300 years. So what I'll do, I'm going to show PowerPoint and just go back a little bit, before the printed cookbooks, and just see how the evolution of, just sort of explore the evolution of Mexican food. And then I'll be happy to answer questions. We're going to end around the 1450s. And then we can talk a little bit about what's happening, today after the PowerPoint. But I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and just start here. No cookbook here, of course. Just sorry, so let me just move my little face here, my little, the icons, move it to the side, sorry. Okay, so that I can see what I'm doing. So, sorry, one sec. Okay, so here we go. So at the time of the Spanish conquest, we have these, corn gods, all these different gods and goddesses being worshipped. There had been already, sophisticated empires across the country, from the Mayans to, the Olmecs, the Aztecs, and lots of different indigenous cultures in between. But the life force of the America was corn. It was, humans, according to the Mayan Book of Creation, humans were molded from masa or corn dough. There is this worship of corn, different stages of worship of corn. It was the life force of the Americas, imbued with so many religious connotations. Of course, by the time we get to the Spanish conquest in 1519, the Europeans equated this native crop with their wheat, which was their Eucharistic wafer, their body of Christ, and immediately suppressed it. So right from the get-go with the conquest, food was a means of social control, with the indigenous population relegated to eating corn and its product, and the European population eating wheat and bread and those products. So this life force became a divider of classes almost immediately. So we don't have any recipes recorded pre-conquest. We know what they were eating based on images on vessels, on wall paintings, but not necessarily, anything that was recorded, no recipes or anything like that recorded. But at the conquest, we see this exchange of cultures and of foods that were happening with the Manila galleons. So this is actually in 1939, the first printed map showing the Americas, which I find fascinating. But the Manila galleons were these ships that were connecting, for about 250 years, were connecting Asia to Mexico. Asia, specifically the Philippines, which was then a Spanish colony, they were making trips between Manila, hence the name of the Manila galleons, to the coast of Acapulco for about 250 years. So it was the first true global exchange. So into Mexico came things that we see a lot in Mexican cooking, like herbs like cilantro, citrus, so lime. We see lots of lime in Mexico. Things like sugar, pomegranates, raisins, all sorts of different old world fruits and vegetables, mangoes, from Asia. Sugar, of course, as well, went into Mexico, and out went things like tomato, chocolate, vanilla, corn, of course, beans. So it was this first instance of global exchange. So the food of the world changed completely, but Mexican food as we know it today was really formed around this time period. And so we start seeing this exchange, And the first people that were actually getting access to everything that was coming in from the old world on these manila galleons were convents. So essentially, Mexican cuisine was developed in convent kitchens during these 300 years of colonial rule. So Mexico was under colonial rule from 1521 to 1821. We just celebrated those 200 years of independence just this past Wednesday, which was Mexican, Independence Day. But I want to show one more image of this sort of clash of cultures, which is so prevalent, in all aspects of daily life in Mexico. Definitely the cookbooks, but even architecture. I mean, this is the Cathedral of Mexico City. So this is the Templo Mayor, which was the grand, great Aztec temple that was destroyed in 1521 when Mexico became part of the country. But you could see the cathedral right here in the background. So essentially the Europeans took the stones of the temple, of this grand temple, and used those same stones to build the cathedral. So it's just this idea of these indigenous cultures were suppressed. The indigenous people were forcibly converted to Christianity. And this is where this separation between wheat and corn came into play. We see it in grand architecture when we're walking around cities like Mexico City, but we also see it as simply, in something as what people are eating. But these images just completely blow my mind. And if anybody has been there, you can attest to this. You see these skulls in the background and then the cross in the foreground. And it is really quite, spectacular. But again, the church was getting first dibs on all of these ingredients that were coming into the country. And we don't have any printed cookbooks around this time, even though we start seeing the first printed cookbooks from Europe being sold in Mexico as early as 1585. So whatever was being printed in Europe had been making its way to Mexico. But we see a lot of kitchen manuscripts, so written manuscripts. And probably the most important one is the one written by this woman here, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. She was a nun, a poet, a philosopher. She was published in Spain, widely read in Spain. She was basically a superstar, and what I like to say, a reluctant cook. She didn't really want to spend time in the kitchen, which was what nuns did at this time, but she sort of had to. So she kind of saw kitchen work as, she was interested in the transformation of ingredients. And she was sort of poetic about how she saw, food and cooking. But it's in these convents that we first start seeing things like mole, this very quintessential Mexican dish that has native chocolate with sesame seeds that are coming in from the old world. Also raisins, and it has wheat, and it also has burnt tortillas in it. So it's this combination of flavors and ingredients that are blended together to make this dish. Even in architecture, these typical, colonial Mexican kitchens have this tile called talavera, which is this blue-white, sometimes with, yellow color. And this is something that had also made its way to Europe, inspired by this, Islamic pottery. The Moors had already been in Spain for centuries, had been in Spain for centuries prior to the conquest. So we see this mix of ingredients. We see these beautiful objects that were initially inspired by Chinese porcelain. They're trying to recreate this Chinese porcelain, but didn't have any porcelain. So they're much more rustic, they're much more crude. They're very but they're very typically Mexican. So this is a chocolate jar. So this is where we start seeing again this blend of ingredients. And Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz actually wrote a cookbook, or has her recipes were put together and actually released not that long ago. I have a book here, Sor Juana en la Cocina, Sor Juana in the Kitchen, with 36 recipes attributed to her, including some of the earliest written recipes for mole. Also lots of sweets. So we see a lot of convent sweets that were very much inspired by these Middle Eastern sweets. Lots of fruit with sugar. We see lots of nuts also in these candies. So it's this really interesting mix of techniques that are coming from the old world mixed with ingredients that are from both worlds. A lot of these convent sweets have these new world fruit mixed with sugar, and syrups, and it's just this really fascinating mix of ingredients. Also the recipe for buñuelos, which is sort of a fried dough with sugar and cinnamon, that an early recipe for that appears in this particular cookbook. So it's quite exciting. So this colonial period is when we think of Mexican food today, this is when it really sort of evolved. But the indigenous people were sort of relegated to the outskirts of society, or I should say the indigenous, the sale of indigenous products were really relegated to the outskirts of societies. And with this suppression of this native ingredients also came this sort of this whole caste system that was created, which we see even in art. So they have these paintings, they're called Casta Paintings, that were essentially meant to be shown in natural history museums in Europe. And it is essentially, Europe thought that the Americas were this wild, place, that there was no order. So there was this caste system that was created to show Europe that yes, in fact, there was order, with the Spaniards being at the top and the indigenous people at the bottom. And you'll see that this applies to the earliest cookbooks that were actually printed. But everybody has a name, and there are 16 different categories. So these paintings were made in a series of 16. So in this particular one, these are from the LA County Museum of Art. They have actually 3 in this series. But you see the Spaniard, the pure Spaniard mixed with the Morisca, which is already sort of a mix. And then their offspring is called an albino. So albino is just not known as, it's not the genetic mutation, not seen as the genetic mutation, but as one of the mixes. But in this particular case, we see this boy that is very light-skinned. He is nicely dressed. Actually, everybody is nicely dressed. He's reading. And if you look over here on the corner here, everything is labeled. The people right here are labeled. You have old world fruit. There are some peaches, there's a melon, there's some apples. So you have old world food. And then this one, the Spaniard, is now married to albino. In this case, the albino is darker skin, and then their offspring is returned backwards. So it's a sort of a darker skin. So this little boy is holding a basket on his head. He's barefoot, and you see indigenous fruit in the foreground. We have prickly pear and some avocados, which are kind of hard to tell here, but we start seeing the separation in classes, and food goes along with the way that the people are separated in classes. So it's really quite fascinating and quite terrifying as well, because these paintings initially, they're so beautiful. They look like just these families walking in the park, but they were really meant to be used as a means of social control. If you were an indigenous person and you wanted to sell your products, you had to go to the outskirts of a city like Mexico City to buy them. But around this time, cookbooks, like I said, 1585, the earliest European cookbooks were entering the country. But we see in the 17th century, some of the most famous cookbooks in Europe at the time became very famous in Mexico and very popular in Mexico. Something like Bartolomeo's Scapi, 1622. Right now with Mexican independence, there's a dish called chiles en nogada, which is these stuffed peppers with a walnut sauce and pomegranate seeds. They're very, typical this time of year in Mexico. They're red with the chiles red, the white sauce, and then the red pomegranates. The chiles is green. They're the colors of the Mexican flag. This is actually, a lot of the ingredients in these peppers are seasonal, but there is a similar recipe in Bartolomeo's Scapi made with stuffed cabbage. That same recipe appears in this particular book by Francisco Martinez Montillo, a Spanish cookbook. So these recipes were being adapted to Mexican ingredients. Also, the French Lavarins, the French cook. These are cookbooks that were very popular in France. All published. Scapi was published in the 16th century. These were both published in the 17th century. I have some later editions here, but these were making their rounds in the country, and the foods of the country were adapting to these European flavors. And also we see, Italian influence. There's a very popular recipe in Mexico called fideo, which is basically little noodles. So we see noodles, we see, again, these different ingredients making their way into the country, and different, not so much ingredients, but also ways of preparing ingredients making their way into the country. And this brings us to the first cookbook. So Mexican independence, 1821. The first cookbook isn't printed until 1831. And this is called El Cocinero Mexicano, the Mexican, cook. So it was actually printed, and it was printed up until 1909. So it actually had a good run. It was first printed as just the Mexican cook, and then it was printed as the dictionary of Mexican cooking. But it was essentially the very first cookbook that you see that was printed. It doesn't read like a Mexican cookbook. It reads like a French cookbook, a European cookbook. The only tortillas that are in the book is the Spanish tortilla with potato and egg. We don't actually have any tortillas, like a corn tortilla. We don't see it in the cookbook at all. There are a couple of recipes for tamales. There are a number of different recipes for mole, but we do see things like crepes with huitlacoche, which is this fungus from the corn. We see noodles again. I mentioned the fideo before. There are also these other noodles called tallarines, which are basically like spaghetti, with a mild poblano pepper sauce. We see things like avocado mousses. We see things like vol au vent, stuffed with chicken with maybe tomatillo sauce. Not a lot of spice. Everything is very, very mild, but they're using indigenous ingredients in a very European way, but still no mention of corn, other than the tamales here and there, but like a corn tortilla or taco enchilada, anything like that, we don't see that, at all. This particular recipe was printed in the cookbook. It was printed in Mexico. It was also printed in Paris, and it was actually quite popular in France as well as in Mexico, and it also made its rounds all over Europe and all over Latin America. It was quite a popular cookbook, published both in Mexico and in Paris. was lucky enough, the last trip I made to Mexico City, I was able to find a 1909 copy. This is the last year that it was printed. And it's actually quite beautiful with all of these, very, very beautiful, illustrations in the book. So this is the first cookbook, 1831. And then we see a number of different cookbooks that made their way around this time period. Again, all very, very European. Until we start getting to the end of the century, there's one recipe, this one cookbook. I don't have an image of it here, but it's called La Cocinera Poblana, the cook from Puebla. And this particular cookbook has an homage to our nun, Sor Juana, that we saw before. She lived in Mexico City in the Convent of San Jeronimo, which today is a university. It has one of the best art schools in Mexico. And she has sort of a nod to her. There are these empanadas made with masa, so made with corn dough, stuffed with meat. And they're called the empanadas of San Jeronimo, so as a nod to her. So this was the first published in 1872. So as we get later in the century, we start seeing more and more native ingredients make their way into the cookbooks, but different in the way that the Nuevo Cocinero Mexicano, we see them more, they feel more familiar as Mexican, food today. We see more corn products. It starts, and even this particular book, it was printed, multiple times up until 1909. It actually went to, I think, about 19 different public editions. It had a really good run. Each edition you start seeing more enchiladas, you start seeing more recipes that feel more Mexico. It starts going a little bit away from the strictly European recipes. So it's quite interesting in how we sort of see the evolution of these particular foods until we get to, and then we have this one, which is quite interesting. Even though things get a little bit more, feel more Mexican, this particular book, The Physiology of Taste by Brillat-Savarin, first published in France in 1825. It was actually published in Mexico translated into Spanish and published in Mexico before it was published in Spain. So 1852, this was, very, very, very popular book. But even then, we start seeing more and more recipes that feel more, Mexican. And then we get to this period. So as we start getting closer to, to the 1910s, to the 20th century, so a few centuries after independence in 1821, there were a group of people, of conservatives in Mexico, that weren't very thrilled about being independent. So Emperor Maximilian, he was a Habsburg from Austria. He was then brought over to Mexico to rule the country. So for a very brief period of time, very brief, just 4 years, Mexico was again under European rule. This didn't last very long. So he was executed. This was not a happy, a lot of Mexicans were not happy, but he preferred the European style of cooking that he was used to in Europe, being a royal in Europe. But he also began to introduce things like tamales, pulque, which is this fermented beverage made out of the agave plant. He started to introduce these foods into the royal table. He really embraced Mexico. And I think he probably would have been good had he not, been European. But then came this man here, Porfirio Diaz. He was a mestizo, he was a mixed race from Oaxaca, and he was in power for decades. Even though he was from Mexico, unlike this Austrian man, he decided that, yes, the reason that corn, maize, and its products are what are keeping the people down, repressed. he was a Francophile. He's actually buried in Paris. He fled, Mexico right before the revolution. He's actually buried in Paris. But during his regime, he was a Francophile. During his regime in Mexico City, you could buy pâtés, you could buy French wines. This is what he was, all about. So my great grandfather was actually his dentist, which I find quite interesting. But he was definitely kept, and he opened the country to foreign investments. So it was during this time, 1876 to 1910, the country was open to Americans, to, British people. So people were coming from all over. So a very small percentage of people were making a lot of money, whereas the indigenous population was getting even poorer. Food cost was rising. It was disastrous to the native population, and actually to most people other than the 1%. This regime, it's called the Porfirian regime, was actually completely disastrous. But one person, there was one particular cookbook, cookbooks were still being published, but one particular cookbook was published, during this period, 1896, which was one of the most significant cookbooks. And this was also the very first cookbook written by a woman in Mexico. Her name is Vicenta Torres de Rubio. I can't believe I have an E there. It's Vicenta. It's an A. Sorry about that. I just caught that. It was probably auto-corrected. But this woman, it's called Cocina Michoacana. This woman Michoacan is a state in central Mexico, if you're not familiar. But she had a very popular newspaper column that ran all over the country. And she would sometimes list recipes in her newspaper column. And she basically, in one of these columns, she asked women from all over the country to send her their recipes, their favorite recipes. So 1896, we see Cocina Michoacana being published, and it's quite beautiful with these illustrations. But it's not only the first cookbook published by a woman in Mexico, it's also the first regional cookbook in Mexico. So this blows my mind, right? So this Mexican, culinary history is so rich, has been around for literally millennia, way before the conquest. There were incredible foods being, made. But this is the first time in 1896, is the first time that people around the country knew what everybody else was eating. So it's the first time that a person in, say, Baja could see what a person in the Yucatan was eating. So, and maybe they can find the ingredients to make something like a cochinita pibil, or, maybe somebody, in this, I have this image here of Nuevo Laredo, which is where I grew up, right on the border of Texas and Mexico. She has a recipe for hens. So somebody with a recipe, maybe somebody in Oaxaca could make something like this, and then somebody in Nuevo Laredo could make mole. So the country really saw what everybody else was eating. She also has a lot of recipes for kind of like an old school European manual of just sort of household management. So we see that a lot in this cookbook. We see some of that in previous cookbooks as well. A lot of these previous cookbooks we don't know actually who wrote them. They're anonymous cookbooks, writers. So this particular one we see, and it's written for women who cook. She kind of gives a little jab at the Porfirian regime. Like, this is a truly Mexican cookbook. This is how people are actually cooking in this country, not in the European manner of these other cookbooks that are being disseminated around the country. So she does make these little jabs, but at the same time, she has recipes for aspics. She has recipes for these, creamy French style soups. So in that sense, it's the sort of quintessentially Mexican recipes. You have a recipe for, enchiladas, next to a recipe for aspic, next to a recipe for, crêpes Suzettes, and a recipe for, cajeta, which is this, Mexican goat's milk, like a caramel. So this essentially, it's the first real Mexican cookbook. And I was actually able to find a copy of it. It's not the real copy on Abe's Books. And it actually came from India. Somebody in India, Pranava Books in India is actually doing a lot of reproductions of Mexican cookbooks, which I find quite interesting. But it is a wonderful, wonderful cookbook. And it's also the first time that women across the country are united, through food. And it's essentially, it's a book written by a woman for women. And this is 1896. So just before the Mexican Revolution. Mexican Revolution begins in 1910 and it ends in 1920. And this is when the food in Mexico really, everything in Mexico really changes. And this is the time we start seeing it a little bit in Vicenta Torres de Rubio's recipe, even though there's this one section in her cookbook that she has a recipe for pozole, which is this, hominy stew that is a pre-colonial dish. She sets it apart and says that this is a recipe for the indigenous population. So even though she's criticizing the Porfirian regime, she at the same time she's giving a nod to the people that are buying these cookbooks because she wants to sell cookbooks. So it's a quite fascinating, really fascinating cookbook. But we see, if we read between the lines of these recipes and her commentaries, we see the changes that are happening in this time in all aspects of life. And then we get to, the revolution. So the revolution, we see a lot of women publishing cookbooks. So this is 1934, a little over, almost 40 years after Vicenta's cookbook. So it's during this time that there's this movement called the Indigenism movement. We see the city of Mexico, Mexico City, and other parts of the country are growing. So a lot of things are being excavated. There's this renewed interest in studying the roots in Mexicans' history, who have now had, centuries of cultural mixing. They're exploring their roots, not in the Spanish conquistadors, not in European culture and cuisine, but in the roots of the country itself. So somebody like this woman here, Ana Maria Hernandez, she was a teacher, she was an activist. She really encouraged, people to get an education, to use this land, which had been really not really cared for all of these centuries, especially during the Porfirian regime, for the decades of the Porfirian regime, would just grow your own fruits and vegetables. She was an activist. She was, out there trying to get public mills for women in rural areas to be able to go to public mill to grind their corn, the nixtamalized corn, which I didn't really talk about, but I could talk about it after in the talk, which is when we do the Q&A. But essentially the nixtamalization was, they would cook corn with lime, the hydrogen, hydrogen, I can't remember what it is exactly. It's a mineral that brings out all of the nutrients in the corn. But this corn then had to be ground to make masa. And for centuries, it was being done on a metate, which is grueling work. And even Vicenta has instructions on how to use a metate in her book. But Ana Maria Hernandez was really instrumental in getting the government to install public mills in rural places so that women could just go and put their nixtamalized corn in there and just have it. So she did so much for the country, but we see a lot of the recipes that are in her book, we see in the first cookbook ever published. It had already been, these European style recipes had already been so much a part of Mexican cuisine. We see also these changes not only appear in in the cookbooks, but also just in life, in daily life. People like Diego Rivera were part of this Indigenism movement. This is when we hear names like Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and all of these big, Mexican muralists. This is the Mexican Renaissance, it was called in this period. They're, again, exploring their roots in the country itself, in the indigenous population, and in the indigenous artwork as well. So he did this wonderful series of this grand, Tenochtitlan, the market and the great city. The first image that I showed that had, the cathedral built over the grand Aztec temple. This is where, pre-conquest was this fantastic market, the market of Tlatelolco, which was the greatest market in all of Mexico. Really, people would come from all over just to shop at this particular market. There's a lot written about it in the diaries of conquistadors about this particular market. That it was just there were so many. One of the conquistadors was describing it as there were so many fruits and vegetables and colors that it was like a dream. It was something that I had never seen before, that they felt like they were dreaming. And also another thing that they were commenting on was how clean everything was. So this is a part, one section of a larger mural that Diego Rivera did for the National Palace. It's just directly catty-cornered to that cathedral that we looked at the beginning. So here we see corn, we have squash, we have the cal, which is the lime that's used for the nixtamalized corn. We have a woman selling tortillas. We have a person selling different kinds of corn. This person here has a basket of cocoa beans, and they're actually trading with cocoa beans. So they're really showing the history of Mexican markets in this one particular section of a larger mural. So he, of course, was really, he loved, to eat with his hands. He thought that using forks was just so colonial. So he was really such a strong proponent of this sort of Mexican, culture, which, of course, he spent many, many years in Paris honing his skills as an artist. So we see people like Frida Kahlo exploring her roots as well, dressing like an indigenous woman. She had her mother's copy of Nuevo Cocinero Mexicano. She also loved cognac. She liked to have like a little bit of cognac, but as soon as Diego Rivera would come in, she would switch to tequila. So it's just both of these worlds are so ingrained. And she's studying her roots, as most people in Mexico are of mixed race. I mean, it was centuries of cultural mixing, and at the very beginning, there weren't enough Spanish women for the number of Spanish men. So, but there were people coming from all over. So there's a little bit of Spanish, there's the indigenous mixed with African, mixed with Asian. So it's such a sort of interesting mix. Frida Kahlo herself, her father was German, and on her mother's side, her father was indigenous and her mother was of mixed descent. But we see this interest in studying the roots and where people came from. So this is 1936. So all of this movement, it lasted for quite some time. And I think I have one more image to show. I just want to end with this woman here, Josefina de Velázquez de León, who's so interesting and just fascinating. We said that Dorothy Rubio was the first woman to publish a cookbook, and also the first person to publish a regional cookbook. This woman in the 1930s, she started a cooking empire in Mexico, an absolute empire. She had a cooking school. My grandmother actually taught cooking, took cooking classes from her in the 1930s in Mexico City. But she went around the country collecting recipes and would print these small pamphlets of regional cookbooks. And these are basically, in the US, we know these as, charitable cookbooks or community cookbooks. their little pamphlets to raise money for a particular cause. So she did this all over the country, regional recipes, and then also just different, recipes. You can still find them in cookbooks in Mexico. I actually have a few of them that belong to my grandfather, but there's some, like this is one, of yeast bread, and here's another one of just modern cooking. So she has a lot of these different recipes. But one thing that is very significant about her, and why I want to wrap it up with her, is that in 1946, she published she put all of these little pamphlets together. She published over 150 little pamphlets. And she wrote the second regional cookbook in Mexico. This is in 1946, so almost 5 decades after Vicenta Torres de Rubio. But what she does is she gives a history of Mexican cuisine and where things came from. This book she published in 1947 in the US as the Mexican cookbook devoted to American homes. Now, this book, here is one section on desserts, which has these little nuns, which we started with. So she has a whole section of desserts. She has a whole section on corn. She has a whole section on chocolate. And then at the end, she has regional cookbooks. But this is so fascinating because it's completely bilingual in that she has them separated by columns. So here in this particular, I just opened it to this chiles rellenos, and it's hard to tell from this little, on this little square, but you could see that there are 2 columns. So one column is in Spanish and the other column is in English. So it's the first time in 1947 that an American audience was introduced to the complexities of Mexican cuisine. And this kind of went by the wayside, which is coming back today, but she really explains this wonderful history of all of these ingredients. She talks about using the metate, but says, Mexican women now, they'll use a blender. So it's 1947. It's a little bit, it's about convenience, but she's introducing these complexities to an American audience. And actually, Julia Childs was a huge fan of her book, and was at Harvard Library. So I think that, she's, she has cocktails, she has all sorts of regional dishes. A lot of recipes that we see here, we also see in the first 1831, cookbook, and also cookbooks that appear in these earlier, especially the sweets that appear in Sor Juana's cookbook. So these become, so much a part of the Mexican culture. She actually had a TV show, publishing empire, the cooking school, and then she also had a very popular TV show in Mexico City at the time. She died in the early 60s, and that was it. Her story kind of ended there. She ran the school with her sisters. The sisters didn't want to have anything to do with it. The story goes, they put all of the stuff out on the sidewalk and it was gone the next day. Last time I was in Mexico City, I looked for it, and it's an auto mechanic shop. But she was instrumental in really sharing and introducing the complexities of Mexican culinary history to an American audience. And so I will end with her, and I would love to answer, any questions that anybody may have. That was a lot in a short period of time, but I would, if anybody has any comments or any questions, I would love to hear. And thank you for listening.
Well, we really appreciate this presentation. And if people have questions, you have a couple of ways to ask them. You can either use the chat function and put your question there, or you can use the raise hand function. And David, who is with the Ann Arbor District Library, he will unmute you and you can ask your question.
So there's one question that came in through the chat. asking to compare how early wine was used in Mexican versus European cooking.
Oh, wine, how it was used in Mexican. You know, I think it's pretty much used the same way. I mean, there were a lot of wines were coming in from Europe at that time, you know, especially during the colonial period. There was wine that was starting to be made in places like Baja, but Europe did not like that because Europe wanted to send their wines. But we do actually see, you know, a little bit of cooking with wine. But actually, that's a good question. I've sort of come across it, but I haven't really started to think about it. I don't see any wine in Sor Juana's recipes, but that's a good question, and I'm not really sure how to answer because I have seen wine being used. I'm looking at the cookbook to see if anything will pop out. But I will have to get back to, we'll have to really study this and get back to Glenda to follow up with you on that. But there is wine being used. We see a lot of sauces, like you know, the typical sort of French, you know, sauces that we see. So we do see, now that I'm kind of refreshing my memory, you know, adding a little bit of wine to deglaze a pan. So we definitely see things like that in sort of a European, you know, the same way that we would in Europe. And this is something, of course, that a very small percentage of the population would actually have access to wines. I don't know if that answers your question, probably not, but I'll dig deeper into this. That's a really good question.
This is Glenda again. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of the division between the flour use of flour and the use of corn? And I know that in parts of Mexico the tortillas are made of corn, and other parts of Mexico they're made with flour. And kind of where's that demarcation line?
That's a good question. Well, I mentioned, you know, at the beginning that it became a means of sort of suppressing corn when the people were actually, you know, the native population were being converted to Christianity, and it just became a means of social control. But in most Mexico, southern Mexico, central Mexico, we see the corn tortillas, or in the north, we see flour tortillas. And this is essentially because it's just the climate is better. It's drier, it's hotter, it's easier to grow wheat in the northern climate. So this is why in these particular areas, this is why we see when the conquistadors were moving up north, they brought their wheat with them. And so this is why we see flour in the northern regions, essentially because that's where it was being grown. And so we actually see both. I grew up growing up on the border of Texas and Mexico. I grew up with both of them, but my parents, who were more from central Mexico and the Yucatan, they were a little bit like, at the beginning it was like, I mean, I don't remember this, but they would say at the beginning it was like, flour tortillas, like this is so, you know, so different, you know, to them. Also, another thing that we see, ingredient that we see in northern Mexico that we don't necessarily see in other parts of the country as much is cumin. You see it a lot in sort of, say, Tex-Mex cuisine, a lot of heavy cumin in rice dishes, which we don't really see that much. I mean, granted, mole has cumin in it. It's one of the many spices that is in it, but it doesn't really taste like, you know, cumin. It's or smell like cumin because it's such a mix. Say, just like in an Indian cuisine, it's such a mix that you can't really pinpoint one particular scent. But in northern cuisine, a lot of among the conquistadors that moved up north were of Berber descent, and they brought their cumin, you know, with them. So we see it a lot in northern Mexican and also southern Mexican cuisine. So we see cumin and we see flour tortillas. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Welcome. Anybody else? Any other comments or questions?
So there are a few left in the chat here. April says that she visited Oaxaca. I think I'm pronouncing that right, and learned about many different varieties of corn there and the history of corn as well. And April was wondering if there are any cookbooks that talk about that.
About corn?
Yes.
Specifically?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. Well, not from these early cookbooks, but there's one cookbook in the 80s that was published that was all corn. I don't have the name, but I can actually look it up real quick in my notes, but yes, so you don't really see it in these particular cookbooks that I mentioned. We start seeing corn ingredients, but there are so many different varieties of corn, especially in places like Oaxaca. They have so many different varieties, and there's so much coming back, all of these heirloom corns and land-raised corns, and there's such a movement in Mexico proper, lots of different organizations that are helping just bring this back, because after in the 90s with NAFTA and with the free trade agreement, most corn that is actually consumed in Mexico today is actually imported or exported from the US to Mexico, which is a tragedy for the Mexican, economy, and for the Mexican, land, that most corn is being consumed as American, and the corn, a lot of the corn that is actually being grown in Mexico now is GMO corn, which has really devastated the land. But there are a number of organizations in Mexico proper that are working with farmers in Oaxaca specifically, different parts of the country, but in Oaxaca, there's a huge movement to bring this corn back. There's also a couple of, one American company that comes to mind called Macienda, and they're working with local farmers for them to sell their products on a global scale. But in the 80s, there were the Conaculta, which is actually a government-funded organization that published the first cookbook that was entirely corn. And I'm gonna pull this up because I have it on my notes, and I'll type it in the chat so that you could see what it is. It is available. It is available online, and I'm sorry. I'm gonna look it up. If anybody has any other questions while I do that, because it is quite interesting, and it is available today. And there's also so many others. I mean, there's famous Mexican chef right now, Enrique Olvera. He has Pujol, which is one of the best restaurants in the world right now in Mexico City. He has a lot of corn dishes in his cookbooks. He uses them in a very unique way, like corn sort of in sweet dishes. And I'll put that name in the chat as well. I'll put his name in the chat as well. Whoops, sorry about that. I didn't mean to do that. I was looking for I want to pull up that cookbook so that I can put it in the chat. But any other questions while I look that up?
Sorry, it's muted. So we do have a couple here. I'll throw you an easy one since you're looking. Randy wanted to be reminded the author of the cookbook you mentioned, the first one, Nuevo Cocinero Mexicano.
Yes. Yeah, I'm gonna put that in. Nuevo Cocinero. And this is an anonymous author, but you can find it on Amazon. The Nuevo Cocinero, I'm going to put it in the form of a dictionary. That is available. Reproduction is available on Amazon. I'm going to put that down. And it's quite interesting. So that's that one. And then Enrique Olvera is a contemporary Mexican chef who has some really interesting recipes for corn in his cookbooks. And I think I found it. Let's see. Okay, sorry, I'm looking, but if you want to send any other questions my way, because I think I got it. I think I found that cookbook. Yes, let me see where it is. Here it is. There it is. I just put that in there.
Great. We do have a couple more here. Sugar being a colonial product, what was the perspective on Mexican sweets? Was it embraced by the nativists or the Europeanists?
It was embraced by everybody. I think just, sugar. I mean, prior to sugar, it was honey, or it was agave. It was actually also corn syrup was actually being used. But sugar was introduced, soon. It was one of the ingredients that was embraced, immediately. And it was definitely used a lot in, convent sweets, and Mexican sweets are one of the things that the country is really known for. It's sweets with fruit, with dairy, kind of similar to Indian sweets, you could say, just using slightly different, ingredients, but it was absolutely embraced. It was a product that was absolutely embraced. Who doesn't love sugar, right? But yeah, as a product, it was absolutely embraced.
Great. Question from Jared. Was it mandatory to remove Catholic influences to get a cookbook published during the Revolution, especially in the earlier stages?
I don't think so. I think that people were just, if you could publish, you would publish. I think that as the centuries, as the decades, as the centuries, progressed, these Mexican food really, it just became what it is today. It became, sugar just became part of the conversation. Wheat, I mean, when we think of, pan dulce in Mexico, I mean, it's so typically, pan dulce, the conchas, right, that have the little shell-shaped, sugar on top. Those, you don't see those anywhere else in the country. Those are intrinsically Mexican. And just like anything, when ingredients make their way, they become, they become their own thing. So I think that that's just it's just what happened, it just did, religion aside, the cuisine just sort of evolved. And at the very beginning, it was, the pure white bread was the most expensive bread. And then, mixed with a little bit of, darker wheat, it was less, expensive. But we start seeing these really inventive, breads, especially during the 19th, century. And a lot of bakeries from that period are still, around today. The croissants become the, cuernitos. I mean, there's so many things that they were trying to emulate the French style bread, but then they made something completely unique and completely their own.
Great, we got one more, and this might actually be a nice one to bring it home if we don't have anything else coming through. William asks, there seems to be a flowering of Mexican cooking in the US today. There's an enormous difference in the availability and variety of Mexican food today compared to the 60s. Do you have any thoughts about this personally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic. I think that it's wonderful that people are really being exposed to the complexities of Mexican cuisine. And I think at the, in the 1970s, and there was this, I think things like, television, commercials, they would show, a person with castanets, and they're actually selling Mexican food. And it's like, well, castanets are Spanish. And there's this whole thing is like, it's a Mexican Spanish. And it's like, what's the difference? And it's like, it's an enormous, difference. They're two completely different cultures. And I think that now, because there are many more ingredients available, many more Mexican immigrants in the country, I think, and it's one of the most complex and rich and diverse, cuisines in the world, really, that I think it's really exciting that people are being exposed to this, and that that and people are tasting this, and hopefully are as excited about all of this as really as I am. But I think it's fantastic that these foods are being and regions are really being celebrated.
Great. I don't see anything coming through the chat, but I do have one question. What's your favorite Mexican dish?
Oof.
I know, hard to pick, right?
Oh, that's so hard. I love mole. I love black mole. I think I would say that. I really love a good Oaxacan mole. Yeah, actually, I would say that with fried plantains. I don't know. Yeah, fried plantains, that could be Caribbean, right, or anything. But yeah, I always say my last dish could be a dish of fried plantains with mole on top. So, but the chiles en nogada that I mentioned, earlier, the stuffed, the stuffed chile, it's stuffed with beef and pork and dried fruit and nuts with this creamy walnut sauce and pomegranates. That's a really close second. But it's a tough one.
Yeah, Maite, thank you so much. I agree. The first time I had chiles en nogada was on Mexican Independence Day and was made by a family of women who were sisters who took a whole day, or 2 days maybe, to make that dish. And it was just amazing. It was just amazing. It's a true family effort. And I would agree, one of the best, and not that common in this country.
It really isn't. No, it actually really isn't.
Undeservedly
Yes.
unknown.
Very true.
Yeah. Well, we want to thank you so much for your time today. This was a fascinating presentation, and we really appreciate it. And we thank you. Muchísimas gracias.
Yes.
And for those who are still with us, just a reminder that we will have a program in October. We're just not quite sure what, so you'll have to check our website, culinaryhistoriansanarbor.org, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll see you next month. And thank you again, Maite. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you, Ann Arbor District Library too, and David.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.